unemployment, bankruptcy, homelessness, a global economic crisis. Should we be optimistic or pessimistic about our global economic recovery? Exploring the impact and seeking solutions, United Nations University presents UNU Conversation Series, The Economic Crisis.
So welcome to this edition of the UNU Conversation Series on the Economic Crisis, organized in connection with the June 2009 UN Conference on the World Financial and Economic Crisis and its impact on development. I am Jean-Marc Coicaud from the United Nations University. And with us here today we have Professor Joseph Stiglitz, who is a professor at Columbia University and of course who was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2001. He's also the chair of the UN Commission focusing on the economic crisis. So we spoke with Professor Stiglitz a few months ago, and today we are back together. And as a way to perhaps begin our conversation, tell us a bit of where we stand now. Give us an update of where we are now compared to where we were in February.
Well, the crisis has obviously continued. The developing countries are actually being hurt more and more. A lot of the discussion at the meeting has been on the how the impacts have been slow to be felt, but are mounting. So, for instance, one of the big differences between the developed and the less developed countries was in the United States and Europe, there was a failure in the financial markets that got translated into the real sector.
Yes.
In the developing countries, it's a failure in the real sector that's being translated into the financial sector. And the failure in the real sector is caused by reduction in exports, the collapse of foreign direct investment, the weakening of capital flows to developing countries. So all these effects, which are follow-on effects from the weaknesses in the developed countries, are now beginning to cause an unraveling in the developing countries. Within the developed countries, there's been in the last probably 6 weeks, 8 weeks, a lot of discussion of green shoots. And the consensus, I think, of the meeting...
What do we mean by green shoots?
Oh,
for the audience.
With discussion of the fact that the spring is here, and that means the economy is on the road to recovery. The general sense at this meeting was
it's not the case.
Not the case. I think the way to think about it is the following. There's a technical sense. Economists talk about a recession as negative growth. And the negative growth may be coming to an end. So the free fall, the decline, the rate of decline is slowing. But that's very different from robust recovery. So what ordinary citizens mean by a recession is high unemployment, can't get a job, that's still there.
And it's going to continue.
And that's going to continue. There's no...
For how long?
Oh, I think a lot of people are thinking this going on for at least maybe another year, 2 years.
And regardless of what we do.
Oh, it makes a great deal of difference what we do. It does make a great deal of difference. But we haven't been doing the right things, and we haven't been doing enough of what we are doing. That's right.
So precisely, give us your assessment of what has been done, both in positive and negative terms.
Well, in the United States, what we've done is that we've begun doing all the things that we should have done much earlier. I mean, there was a paralysis in the Bush administration. Obama's come in and begin to take action. There are 5 areas that things had to be done. Stimulus, doing something about the mortgages, doing something about the bank restructuring, doing something about regulation, and doing something about the international context.
So what's your what is the grade that you give for each of these?
Well, on the stimulus, it is good, but not enough, and not quite well designed. So, for instance, in the United States, about a third of it is goes into tax cuts, not to increase investment, but to encourage consumption. The problem in the United States has never been that we save too much; it's that we save too little. And it's not going to work, more to the point, because with the overhang of debt, people are not going to start consuming. You want to maximize bang for the buck, multipliers.
It's not going to work.
It's going to work a little bit, but not enough. Not enough. There are a number of other problems with it. One of the problems in the United States is that we have a federal structure. While the federal government is giving money, the states are retrenching. They have a balanced budget framework, which means when the revenues go down, they have to cut back expenditures, revenues are plummeting. And so we have this strange situation that the states have to fire teachers and healthcare people while we're building roads. Now, doesn't make any sense. So, and a problem morale. And so, on the mortgages, again, great that we're finally beginning to do something.
We're beginning to do something.
Beginning to do something, but not enough. And some of the things that we've done have been a step backwards. So, well, there are two problems in the United States. We have many mortgages, homes, where people can't make the mortgage payments. And we are trying to help some of these people, small percentage, with those problems. The second problem, related in a sense to the first, is that there are many homes that are underwater. That is to say, the value of the mortgage is higher than the value of the home sinks. Now, these people have an incentive under American mortgages to walk away, because under American mortgages, you can drop your key off with the bank and walk away.
That's it. And
so
this only deepens the problem.
And that only deepens the problem because the bank doesn't know how to manage it well, it excels, the prices decline, and that is a vicious downward circle. We haven't done a thing about that. Why? Because the banks don't want to admit that there's a problem. And if they restructure the mortgage to write it down, they have to admit that they made a loss. But they made a loss.
But what is going to be the cost of this denial?
The delay is enormous, because the delay lets the problems fester, and that's where we made a mistake. We changed the accounting rules. You know, in the lead up to the crisis, a lot of discussion of lack of transparency. Lack of transparency. So what did we do? We made things less transparent. We said to the banks, don't worry, if they're not paying, pretend that they're going to pay in 20 years. Keep them on your books at the full value. So now no one knows whether a bank is solvent or not. We can't trust the accounting.
So this lack of clarity is a major problem.
Major problem. We made it worse. We made it worse. I think that's unconscionable. Now, the third problem was repairing the banks. Here there were two clear objectives, or three objectives. Getting lending going, not exacerbating the underlying structural problems, at the least cost to the public. We haven't gotten lending going very much. We've exacerbated the problem. Part of the problem was we have banks that were too big to fail, and now they're even bigger.
So it's a failing grade.
A failing grade. I have to, and thirdly, the cost to our taxpayer has been enormous. And we were pouring money into the banks, and they were pouring out money to pay bonuses to their bonuses for what? For record losses?
Yeah, so is it an illustration of what you call the bailing out bankers rather than addressing bank problems?
Exactly. And so again, you have to say, the very back grade.
But so why are we following this path on this specific issue? Because it's mind-boggling.
It's mind-boggling. It is mind-boggling. But remember, how do we get in this problem? We got in the problem through deregulation. How do we get deregulation? The special interest, the banks wanted it. I was in the White House at the time when this big discussion began. I said, this is crazy. We know what this will end up in.
Yes.
But there were too many people making too much profits and giving too much money to the campaign contribution, lobbyists.
But public officials are supposed to be the custodians of the public good.
But we have a revolving door in the United States. People go from Wall Street to Washington and back to Wall Street.
How do we address this? Because it's a major, major issue.
It is a major issue, a major failure in our democracy.
Yes.
Some things are obvious. Obviously, you have to do something about campaign contributions, our dependence on these campaign contributions. We have to have more sunshine on what is going on. And one of the problems is that in America, there is increasing outrage among the citizens, anger, not channeled well, but anger at what they see as an outrage. And I'm afraid that it is really causing major divisions in our society. And you see it, again, coming up in the fourth area that I mentioned, which is regulation. You know, we all knew that there would be something coming out. The real question was, would it be cosmetic or real?
Or meaningful.
And meaningful. Now, there's a continuum. The devil is in the detail. There'll be some things that were real, but would they really deal with the deep problems? One of the deep problems is too big to fail banks.
Yes.
Nothing
But you know, on this issue
is being done about that.
But why is it? Because in the end, for having a systemic risk to be legitimate, one would have to think that a systemic service should be provided to make it legitimate, right? And so, why is it that we don't do anything about this? Because this is a major,
So what we're doing is to say we're going to look at them more carefully.
Yeah,
but no, we were supposed to be looking at this before.
Yes.
And we see that the regulators have a limited ability to do it and limited incentive to do it. And so what is the proposal that is on the table in the United States? To give more authority to the very institution that caused the problem. The Federal Reserve lacks regulation, loose monetary policy. Everybody agrees their failure was at the core of the problem. So what do? Give them more authority.
So, but I mean, I would assume that there are very smart people around the table. Why is it that we don't go for the right option?
Well, there are some people arguing for that, but the influence of the special interests who got into the problem have not disappeared. So it
continues to prevail.
It continues to prevail. Many of us are a little bit surprised how strong these special interests. We would have thought that they would have gone into hiding.
Yes. No shame.
No shame. No shame. And so that is like the bailout causing a lot of anger.
Yes.
And now we're reaching a very delicate situation because the stimulus is not enough, the recovery is not fast enough. Most people anticipate that we're going to need more stimulus in 2010, 2011, but because the bailout has been done so badly and at such expense, everybody looks at the deficit. And to make matters worse, the obvious, the deficit hawks, the people who keep talking about the deficit, mainly from Wall Street, they all went on a vacation from about September of 2008 until March. I don't know if they were down in Florida, they were enjoying life. Not a word about deficit spending when the money was being shoveled into the banks, hundreds of billions of dollars, guarantees, not a word about the deficit. But now that everybody says enough, no more money to the banks, what are they saying? Oh, now we have to start worrying about the deficit. And
Too
this,
late.
now they're beginning to talk about it over and over again. You pick up the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, everybody's talking about, everybody out from Wall Street is talking about the deficit. And there's a clear double standard. You know, the banks have said, we know we're not going to get any more money, so we're going to go back to the world in which the deficit is the only thing we worry about.
Once we have had our share, let's go back.
Not our share, all the money that we can get.
Yes.
We go back, and you know, it was so irony was so clear. When they began shoveling money into the banks said, "Oh, don't worry, this is just an investment. You'll get your money back." No one says that anymore.
So you think that the money, there is no quote-unquote return on investment?
Well, they'll get a negative return. Oh, we'll get some of the money
but
back.
Very little.
Well, just take the case. We poured in almost $200 billion into AIG. That money, of course, was a conduit to money into Goldman Sachs or to other of these investment banks. Had we put the money in Goldman Sachs directly, we would have gotten money back. Goldman Sachs has been borrowing from the Fed, for instance, taking money. You know, we allowed the investment banks to borrow from the Fed, but meanwhile, it's gambling, and hopefully it will win on some of the gambles, and its stock price may go going up. But because we gave the money to AIG, that gave the money to Goldman Sachs, we don't get share in the growth. So we got the lousy stuff, AIG, and no one expects us to get anywhere near the $200 billion that we put into AIG.
Wow. And what about the fifth area that you mentioned, bro?
The fifth area was global.
Global.
No, this is a global
because
downturn.
there is a cost for the world because of all of this.
Oh, very high cost.
So what's the cost? Tell us.
Well, and that brings us to this meeting here at the UN and the conference. The developing countries are among the innocent victims. Clearly, they've been affected in many, many ways. Decrease in remittances, decrease in exports, lower export prices, decrease in foreign direct investment, for capital flows going back to the north from the south. They've been hit in every possible way. But unlike the United States, they can't write the blank checks. We spend trillions of dollars. They can't spend anything. And anything they spend to help the people who are unemployed is less money to spend on development. So it condemns them to increased impoverishment. The good news was the G20 recognized the need for more assistance, but what did they do? Almost all of the money was in the form of loans. Loans through, that makes back into the debt trap. We just got so many of the countries out of the debt trap. Just a few years ago in the Jubilee 2000 movement, we had debt forgiveness. And now we're telling them go back into debt.
So what was the rationale for the G20 to really go for the loan option?
They didn't want to come up with the money.
That's the short answer.
The short answer is very clear. You know, look at the United States and come back. You know, the United States had enormous trouble getting even money to lend to the IMF, to lend on to the poor countries. Even that, the Congress resisted. So asking us to give money, to take on responsibility for the damage that we put. And remember, I think we have a lot of culpability, because while we have a lot of culpability in terms of causing this crisis, we have a second level of culpability because we encouraged these countries to strip away their regulations, to open up their markets, to capital market liberalization, financial market liberalization, which exposed them to these risks. So we told them, adopt these policies and you will be better off.
And then at the end of the day, there is no sense of responsibility coming from developed countries or from the US and so on.
No, in Europe, at least there was a rhetorical sense of responsibility. In Japan, where that did not engage in the practices, there's a moral responsibility, and they're putting up money, even though they had, they weren't, no. So there's a real sense of responsibility. In Europe, I think there is a recognition that we live in an integrated world, and they have some responsibility because they were a contributor to the downturn, and to the policies that hurt the developing countries so much. And so they're putting up substantial amounts of money. But in the United States, the focus is all inward.
So no sense of responsibility, no sense of solidarity. It's all about self-centeredness.
Yeah.
So how do you move forward based on this situation? I mean, how do you contain somehow this sense of self-centeredness?
Well, I think there are two ways. I mean, there are a lot of people in the United States who do feel responsible and have a moral sense of responsibility. And so one point is to strengthen the impact of these groups. And the second one is to point out that it is actually in the U.S. self-interest. The developing countries have been part of the engine of global economic growth. It's going to be very difficult to get robust growth if a significant part of the world economy lags behind. And it will lag behind if we don't do anything. But there's even another aspect, which is America in the years after World War II and the victory in World War II had a certain kind of moral authority, a certain moral authority of leadership. It played a critical role in the creation of the United Nations, and it created the Marshall Plan to help Europe recover. And people look to the United States. Well, this crisis has clearly undermined the confidence in the American model.
Yes. And also in American elites. I mean, in your recent writing, you are talking about precisely how American elites somehow are not only failing America, but also the world to some extent.
That's right. And so, but what is happening, without most Americans realizing it, is there's a turning away from American leadership. You know, things were very badly damaged during the Bush administration. The standing of America was hurt. The world doesn't stand still.
Yes.
The developing country, the emerging markets are taking greater and greater leadership. China, India, even Turkey. And they're stepping in to the gap. Now, in many ways, that's a good thing. That there's more, even the middle-income countries are sharing some of what their recent gains with the poorer countries. That's a kind of global solidarity. I think that's a good thing. At the same time, there are many issues in which America needs the cooperation of others.
So in a way, you're saying that the management of the crisis, rather than contributing to restore the sense of leadership and the credibility and the legitimacy of U.S. leadership, is somehow perhaps contributing to deepen the crisis of leadership.
I think that's right. Remember when President Obama got elected, it was such a
huge political capital.
Huge political capital. And enormous support, relief after Bush departed, a real statement of America's American dream.
Yes.
And what worries me is the erosion of that capital. And it happened once before. 9/11, enormous support for the United States, sympathy for the problem that we faced. The world came together, and part of that coming together was the resolution to have a development round, a meeting in Doha. Things that could not have been done before were done in that moment of global solidarity.
Yes.
But then the Bush administration squandered that, and going to a war in Iraq.
And you're saying that there is a risk here to something similar.
Hopefully not that bad, but it was an opportunity. It is an opportunity. And unfortunately, we're not seizing that opportunity. And let me say, you know, the Obama administration has been trying to do some things, like providing more money to the IMF, but you might say the broad agenda has not been supportive. They should have taken the leadership at this UN meeting here and say, look, this is an important meeting to talk about the impact of the global order, especially in developing countries.
And it hasn't been the case.
And it has not been the case.
So
they have not put a roadblock in it so far, but
they haven't put forward the kind of leadership that you would, you feel is needed.
Yeah, we need. You might say one of the advantages is because it hasn't done it, others have stepped in, and that may be good in terms of creating a diversity of leadership. But still, it would be so much better if the U.S. were right at the center of this discussion, trying to shape it in a constructive way.
So precisely for the way forward, I mean, what is the kind of intellectual roadmap which you feel has to be conceived and followed, and how do you make it happen in practical terms, because this is very difficult, clearly.
Well, the commission that I chaired laid out a roadmap of what needs to be done in the short run, what needs to be done in the long run. It was a roadmap that I think was particularly written and suited for the kinds of discussion we have going forward. You know, you recognize that there are certain areas where there's a global consensus and certain areas where there's not.
Yes.
We can agree more on what caused the problem, or we can agree more on what needs to be done. Then we can agree about the best institutional way of accomplishing that. There are going to be different views on the best way forward, on the details, but we can begin by saying, okay, here are the advantages of this approach, here are the advantages of this approach, here are the things you need to think about, here are the trade-offs. And so what our commission tried to do is lay out precisely that kind of roadmap, not giving the answers, but posing the questions.
And what are the major points of disagreement?
Well,
I think it's going to be difficult to find a consensus.
I think there are, you might say, three broad areas. One is a judgmental thing. Do you create new institutions or reform old?
What is your answer to this?
Both.
Both. Okay.
We have to do everything that the old institutions have to be reformed, but in some cases the speed will be too small. One of the aspects of reformation is that the world has changed. They have to take on new responsibilities. It may not be easy for them to do it, and it may be easier to create a new institution. Let me give you an example where it may be possible to use both old and new at the same time. One of the big issues is what was called surveillance, looking at the economic policies that different countries pursue and judging them. Now, the IMF naturally focuses on inflation. The background of the IMF is financial markets, and financial markets worry about inflation. But the ILO and other people worry about unemployment. That's what most people care about. So it's going to be very difficult to change an institution whose mindset is focused on inflation for 60 years to say, now start caring about working people.
Yes.
But you can bring those two together, ILO and the IMF, and maybe have joint working committees to do that. So you use existing structures, but you create coordinating frameworks together.
And it could be also strengthening of legitimacy for both institutions.
Very much so.
Yeah.
So these are I think some of the creative ways where we use existing institutions, but channel them in ways that meet the needs going forward. A second problem is obviously countries that have a lot of power don't want to give it up. The U.S. is one country with a veto power, the IMF. So it wants the decision making to be inside the organizations that it controls. Not a big deal, not a big surprise,
Yes.
but unacceptable in the 21st century.
So how do you handle this? Because it's a key
Well,
issue. I mean, with the Security Council here at the UN, it's the same problem. So how do you handle this?
Well, again, I think the basic understanding is that we need consensus going forward, and the question is, what is the best way of getting that consensus? And I think we've looked at too much in hard power, less in soft power. Soft power being the ideas, the discourse that gets consensus. So that's where we ought to be focusing more of our attention. Third, because the third point is that money. And resources are scarce, and money lies behind a lot of the problem. You asked before, why is it that money was given to the IMF in the form of loans rather than in the form of grants?
Yes.
Money is the answer. Well, the same thing concerns one of the other big issues, for instance, the global reserve system.
Yes.
The global reserve system is falling apart, it's fraying. People are, the dollar is not a good store of value. I mean, this is just an economic fact. And the instability in the dollar, when it's used as a reserve, creates a lot of global instability. We're moving away from the dollar reserve system. I mean, that's a fact.
It's a fact.
It's a fact. And then the question is, do we move away smoothly or chaotically?
Yes.
And I...
Smoothly would be better.
Well, smoothly would be better, and we have to have discussions of that. The U.S. obviously has some interest in the fact that right now it borrows trillions of dollars at zero interest rate.
Yes.
Now, if somebody would give you $1 trillion interest free loan,
Yes.
you might take it, and you would not want to say, don't change the system. I like this system because it allows me to borrow very cheaply. And you bear all the risk, by the way, because I have these huge deficits, and maybe we'll have inflation, but that's your problem.
But still, to a very large extent, it's also self-defeating for the US on the long run.
Precisely the point. So my view is that this is short-sighted. I mean, just like our banks were short-sighted, I think it's short-sighted on the part of the U.S.
Yes.
This system is fraying, and the instability to which it gives rise is going to cost the U.S. and the rest of the world a great deal. And there are other problems. It's a problem of equity. It's a problem of as the U.S. gets more and more in debt, confidence in the dollar erodes. The system has implications for a balance of payments, the global imbalances, which were a source of the problem. So it is a fundamental aspect of the current crisis. And so that's why our commission put such emphasis on it. You can't ignore it. If you're trying to diagnose the crisis, you have to talk about it. And the G20 didn't want to talk about it. And
yet, in your view, it's not a matter of choice, it's a matter of necessity.
Oh, it's a matter of necessity, and it will happen.
It will happen.
But regional initiatives are already beginning. The Shanghai Initiative, the talk of in Latin America. So it's almost as if we're burying our head in the sand in a short-sighted way to ignore it. And I think it's very good that in the outcome document of the conference, there is an honest statement. Some countries believe something, this is a major problem. And at this stage, that is an accurate description of where the global debate stands. But if you, you say, if you ask many Americans, many American academics who specialize in this, they say, yes, we know it's a problem for America. Some Americans are the most active in, Keynes talked about this, so it's not even a new problem. So it's clear it's something we have to deal with, and I think it would be better to deal with it sooner than later.
And so precisely, so this conference is simply, in your view, a starting point of a process which has to take place in the coming years.
Very much so. It's a starting point. and it's actually been a very good starting point in several respects. That the identification of the issues, the discussion, all been very, very strong. And then it proposes both a working group within governments and a technical advisory process, so a little bit detached from the political process. It is precisely the kind of approach that you need. Now, obviously, the total impact will depend on how these processes work out.
Yeah, and it's going to be a struggle with front lines having to do with ideas, policy, and politics.
Very much so.
Professor Stiglitz, thank you for your time. I know that you have a very, very busy day today. So we're having a conversation with Professor Stiglitz, who is the chair of the UN Commission dealing the economic crisis on the occasion of the UN conference focusing on the economic crisis and its impact on development. I am Jean-Marc Coicaud from the United Nations University, and I thank you for watching. Thank you. Thank you.
Good.